There are things that have happened in life that, even now, the mere act of remembering makes the heart ache as if a wound has just been torn open. A word that shamed us. A look filled with contempt. A cruel deception. A betrayal we never saw coming. Or perhaps a loss so great it can never be restored. They say time heals all wounds, but the truth is, some wounds are not in the flesh. They live in our memories. And memories do not forget. We go on living, smiling, working, yet inside are pieces of the soul left behind. Sometimes it is the abandoned child within. Sometimes the woman betrayed. The man whose closest friend turned away. The son or daughter who carried resentment toward their parents through all of childhood. These parts of us remain in the past, never embraced, never apologized to, and never forgiven. Forgiveness, it sounds like something noble and beautiful. Yet in truth, it is one of the hardest, most painful things a human being can do. Forgiving does not mean denying the pain. It does not mean rejecting the truth. Forgiveness is when we choose not to let the past rule the present. It is when we stop carrying burdens that were never ours to bear. It is when we tell ourselves, I have suffered enough. It's time to let go. But how do you forgive? When the one who hurt you feels no remorse. When they have taken from you what can never be returned. When the pain itself has defined who you are for so many years. And above all, how do you forgive yourself? There are questions we may spend a lifetime seeking answers to. Yet sometimes, the answer comes from something far simpler than we expect. A story from another person, an unfinished letter, an unexpected meeting, a silent moment in meditation, or a quiet cry in the deep of night when no one else can hear. Today, I will share with you such stories. Not to preach, not to instruct, not to make you forgive anyone before you are ready, but so you may understand that forgiveness is not a single act. It is a journey from hatred to compassion, from blame to understanding, from suffering to peace. And on this journey, you are not alone. There are those who once resented the whole world, yet chose to let go. Those who lost everything, yet learned to love again. Those who lived their whole lives under the shadow of guilt, yet found light when they dared to face themselves. These are the stories you are about to hear. Stories that may bring you to tears, that may make you see yourself in them, that may leave you silent for a long time after the video ends. And perhaps, just perhaps, one of these stories will lighten your heart. If that happens, I hope you will understand this. We do not forgive because others deserve it. We forgive because we deserve peace. Are you ready? Let us walk together into the journey of forgiveness, compassion, and release, a place where no one is forced to forget the pain, yet everyone is free to choose how they will go on. A collection of heartfelt stories about forgiveness. When compassion becomes the doorway to peace. Part 1. What is forgiveness, and why should we learn it? 1.1. Is there something you can't let go of? Let's be honest with ourselves. Is there something in your life that you still can't let go of? A memory that aches every time the night falls. A face you always avoid, even though it's been years since you last saw them. A word that wounded you so deeply, it still echoes in your mind as if it were spoken just yesterday. Or a decision you made that you can't stop regretting. A moment in time you keep replaying, wishing you had done things differently. We all carry these tiny thorns inside us. Some are small, but over time, they sink deeper, piercing the soul, becoming part of who we are. We learn to live with them, but quietly, silently, they keep hurting us. These wounds don't always show. They hide behind our smiles, behind our successes, behind the endless busyness of life. But in the quietest moments, we feel them. That something remains unresolved. A feeling we never dared to name. A scar that never healed. Some people carry resentment toward their parents for not protecting them as children. Others loathe themselves for not being strong enough to stop something from happening. Some hold anger toward lovers, friends, or family who betrayed, abandoned, or deceived them. And many live with the silent echo of what if? What if I had spoken up? What if I hadn't trusted them? What if I had left sooner? What if I had been brave enough? Those what ifs follow us like shadows. They don't shout. They don't scream. But they quietly erode our inner peace. We think we've forgotten, moved on, but in truth, we're simply carrying unresolved emotions, unspoken grief. They become like stones in a backpack, weighing down every step we take in life. Have you ever wondered, why am I so quick to anger? Why do I fear abandonment? Why do I find it hard to trust, to love, to be vulnerable. Behind these feelings might lie an old wound, one that was never allowed to heal. Forgiveness, on the surface, seems like something we offer to others. But at its core, forgiveness begins when we turn inward and face the part of us that's been hurt. It's when we sit down and listen, truly listen, to that pain. Not judging it, not pushing it away, but embracing it like a child who simply wants to be loved. It's when we can finally admit, I was hurt. I am still hurting, but I no longer want this pain to control my life. No one teaches us how to forgive. There's no school subject for it. Our parents didn't always know how to model it either. Most of what we've learned about forgiveness is, just get over it. Let it go. Don't think about it. But forgetting is not the same as healing. And moving on is not the same as letting go. Forgiveness is not something we do for them. It is a gift we give to ourselves. It is the first step toward inner peace. Not because the other person deserves it, but because you deserve to live a life not chained to your past. If there's something you still can't let go of, it's not because you're weak. It's because that thing once mattered deeply to you. It was once a part of your heart, a part of your story. And maybe you're just not ready to part with it yet. But you're here now, reading this. And maybe that means, just maybe, you're beginning to want to understand it. To touch forgiveness, even if only gently. So today's question is not, should you forgive? The real question is, what are you still carrying that keeps your heart from being at peace? If you have something, then I invite you to stay. Because perhaps, somewhere in the stories we're about to share, one might softly knock on the door of a place you've hidden away for a long time. And from that place, healing may begin. 1.2. Compassion is not weakness, it is the power that heals. Many of us grow up with a quiet belief. Compassion is weakness. That if you forgive someone, if you open your heart to the person who once hurt you, then you are losing. That if you choose kindness over revenge, you are surrendering your right to be angry, letting others walk all over you. But the truth is the opposite. Forgiveness and compassion do not come from weakness. They arise from deep inner strength. Only when you are truly strong within can you have the courage to resist letting hatred control your heart. Because anger is easy. Hatred is easy. But opening your heart to someone who has caused you pain, that takes a level of spiritual strength most people never touch. Compassion doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean denying the hurt. Compassion is the ability to look directly at the truth, including the parts that broke you, and still choose not to let that pain destroy who you are. It's standing in front of your wounds and saying, yes, I've been hurt. I have the right to be angry, but I also have the right to no longer let this pain define the rest of my life. There are wounds that make us believe, I will never forgive. But as time passes and we begin the journey inward, we start to see that holding on to hatred doesn't make us stronger. It only closes our hearts more and more. And compassion, though it may seem fragile at first, is actually the path to real healing. We don't need to become saints to practice compassion. Compassion doesn't mean loving those who wronged us as if nothing ever happened. It only asks that we let go, little by little, 1 ounce less resentment, 1 wall less around the heart, 1 moment of peace in place of bitterness. And in doing so, we begin to see a simple truth. Everyone is hurting in some way, and that pain is often what leads people to hurt each other. Those who hurt you may have done so out of ignorance, out of wounds they never healed in themselves. This doesn't excuse their actions, but it helps you see, pain breeds pain. When you choose compassion, you're stopping that chain from continuing. You're not passing the pain on. You're doing something they couldn't, and in that, you become stronger than you ever imagined. Compassion is also the bravest thing you can offer to yourself. When you treat your own broken parts with tenderness, when you stop punishing yourself for what you've been through or what you couldn't control, you begin to heal. Compassion doesn't start with others. It starts with you not turning against yourself. Compassion isn't surrender. It's a choice to live lighter, deeper, and freer. Maybe you're not ready to forgive. Maybe your compassion is still buried under years of pain and defenses. But if you can begin with a single thought, I want to understand. I want to let go. I want peace. That's already a sign that the healing power of compassion has begun to awaken in you. Each one a quiet yet profound lesson in forgiveness, compassion, and letting go. Some of these stories are drawn from real lives. People who have faced betrayal, grief, or guilt and still found their way back to peace. Others are fictional, but written with deep empathy and the intention to heal. Whether real or imagined, each story carries the same quiet truth. We cannot change the past, but we can choose how we live with it. And sometimes, forgiveness begins not with grand gestures, but with a single silent moment of release in the heart. These 15 to 20 stories are like scattered pieces of a greater picture, each one offering a gentle reminder. No matter where you are on your healing path, you are not alone. Part 2. Heart-wrenching stories of betrayal and forgiveness. 2.1. Clara, the woman who chose to forgive so she wouldn't destroy herself. Clara lived in a small coastal town in southern Italy, where cobblestone alleys led to the sea and whitewashed houses basked under the Mediterranean sun. She was a quiet, gentle elementary school teacher who loved her simple routines, watering her flowers at dawn, biking home in the evening through fields of lavender. Her life was once peaceful, until everything shattered, not once, but several times, by the very man she believed was her entire world. Her husband, Matteo, was charming and well-spoken, the kind of man who turned heads in every room. But his charisma came with a shadow. Their marriage lasted over 15 years. Yet Clara discovered at least 3 separate betrayals during that time. The first was 3 years in, when she stumbled upon suspicious messages between him and a colleague. The second came when their daughter turned 8. He had been secretly involved with someone else for nearly a year. The third betrayal was the breaking point, not just because of Matteo's actions, but because Clara felt she had lost trust in herself, her worth, her instincts, her voice as a woman who had given everything to their family. But what shocked others wasn't Matteo's infidelity, it was Clara's response. She didn't scream, retaliate, or rush to file for divorce. She simply packed a small suitcase one quiet Saturday morning and left the home they shared, carrying nothing but the ache in her chest and a silence heavy as the early fog. Clara spent the next 3 months in a small monastery in Assisi, a sacred hillside town known for its spiritual quietude and connection to St. Francis. There, no one questioned her. No one judged. She was invited only to breathe, to meditate, and to write. In one of her journal entries, she wrote, "I used to think forgiveness was a reward for the other person. But now I see, it's a gift I give myself, so I don't drown in bitterness." In the end, Clara did not return to Matteo, but she also didn't build walls of resentment. They divorced quietly, with no dramatic court battles or venomous words. When someone later asked how she could be so calm, Clara simply smiled and said, "I chose to live. And to truly live, I had to let go." For Clara, forgiveness wasn't agreement. It wasn't permission. It was her refusal to keep suffering. It was her way of reclaiming herself, her peace, her future, not because Matteo deserved it, but because she did. Clara later shared her story at a mindfulness retreat in Florence. Many wept, not at Matteo's betrayals, but at the profound strength radiating from her gentleness. There are wounds that cannot be shouted through, only breathed through. And Clara, once deeply broken, became a quiet symbol of how forgiveness, when born from compassion, is not weakness, but extraordinary courage. 2.2. I lost everything because of my best friend, and what happened after 10 years left me speechless. They used to call Daniel and Marcus twins not by blood. Ever since high school in Leeds, they were inseparable, studying together, working part-time jobs together, and dreaming together of one day becoming self-made businessmen. When Daniel's parents passed away in a car crash when he was 23, Marcus was the first person at the hospital, and the only one who stayed the whole night. It was a friendship money couldn't buy. Daniel truly believed that. And because he believed it so deeply, he didn't hesitate when Marcus suggested they pool their savings to start a small design consultancy. Daniel had the skills and experience. Marcus had the network and guts. For the first 2 years, they worked like maniacs, skipping vacations, cleaning their own office, even sleeping on the floor of their studio. Their first client was Marcus's aunt's cafe, and from there, the business slowly grew. By the 3rd year, the company was finally making a profit. Daniel felt they had made it. Until one day, he opened their bank account and saw it had been drained. Completely. Without warning. No explanation. Nothing left but panic. Marcus was gone. He cut all ties. No emails, no calls, No replies on social media. Daniel even went to Marcus's mother's house. But she simply said, "He left." Didn't say where. Daniel crumbled. Not just because of the nearly 70,000 pounds that vanished, but because it was the product of blind trust. They had once laughed on the bare concrete floor of their first office. Once shared their last instant noodle packet during a broke winter week. How could someone betray like this? Debt piled up. Daniel had to sell his car, move into his sister's cramped apartment. He took whatever freelance work he could, designing logos, building websites, even repairing furniture. Some nights, he dreamed Marcus had returned, sitting at their old desk, smiling as if nothing had happened. He'd wake up in tears, not from anger, but from a heart that still hadn't learned how to let go. It took 2 years for Daniel to rebuild. He wasn't wealthy, but he had a small studio, 2 loyal employees, and, most importantly, he'd stopped trying to contact Marcus. He no longer wanted revenge or closure. He thought forgiveness was impossible. Until one Saturday morning, 10 years later, the doorbell rang. A man stood outside, gray-haired, tired-looking, but with familiar eyes. It was Marcus. He looked like someone who had lived in shadows for a decade, sunken cheeks, weathered skin, trembling hands. He didn't wait for Daniel to say anything. He simply bowed deeply, as if trying to fold himself in half. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't come to explain, just to say that." Daniel stood in silence. Thousands of rehearsed questions vanished. All that remained was a heavy heartbeat and the emptiness in his chest. They sat down. Marcus spoke without excuses. He had gotten involved in a risky investment, panicked under mounting debt, and drained the company's funds trying to save himself. Then he ran, ashamed and afraid. He fled to Italy, surviving by washing dishes, sweeping floors, and sleeping in his car. Every year, on the anniversary of the day they'd first signed their office lease, Marcus would write Daniel a letter, but never sent any of them. "I know," Marcus said. "There's nothing I can do to make it right. If you want to punch me or kick me out, I'd understand." Daniel didn't reply. He walked into the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of tea. "You still like mint, right?" he asked. Marcus looked up, eyes welling with tears. Daniel didn't forgive him in that moment. But he knew, if he didn't let go, he'd be the one forever trapped. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing to no longer carry the weight. And in that moment, with the warmth of the tea rising between 2 men who had both lost so much, Daniel felt something he thought had died 10 years ago: peace. 2.3. I forgave the brother who took everything from me, for a reason no one could have expected. Caleb and Ethan grew up in the suburbs of Vancouver, Canada. Their family wasn't wealthy, but the house was always filled with laughter. The 2 brothers shared everything, from a worn pair of basketball shoes to the blame for mischievous adventures. Ethan, the older brother, was everything Caleb admired: sharp, ambitious, and full of charisma. Caleb, for years younger, was more reserved and introspective, but he looked up to Ethan with unconditional admiration and trust. But life, as it often does, took a turn that no one could predict. When their parents were killed suddenly in a car accident, the brothers were thrown into a storm of grief, responsibility, and a silent tension that neither knew how to confront. Their parents' modest estate was entrusted to Caleb, as Ethan had been living abroad. Overwhelmed by debts and a series of failed business ventures, Caleb didn't question the arrangement. All he wanted was for them to get through this together. That's when Ethan did the unthinkable. The account was empty. The family home had been mortgaged, and Ethan had disappeared without a single word of explanation. It wasn't just financial loss. What tore Caleb apart was the betrayal. The brother he once trusted above all else had taken everything and vanished. Caleb felt like the floor had collapsed beneath him. The following years were a blur of survival. Caleb took on multiple jobs, rebuilt from scratch, and carried the weight of bitterness wherever he went. He considered suing Ethan. He wrote letters filled with anger only to tear them up. At night, he'd dream of their parents and wake up in tears. But the worst part wasn't losing the house or the money. It was losing his brother. 10 years passed. One gloomy autumn afternoon, Caleb received a call from a hospital in Toronto. A nurse explained they were caring for a patient named Ethan Mitchell, severely depressed, unresponsive, and without any listed next of kin. Except one, Caleb. There was a pause. Then Caleb said, "I'll come." When they met again, Ethan was unrecognizable, frail, hollow-eyed, a shell of his former self. The proud, reading one by one. Then he wept. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. Not because Ethan deserved forgiveness, but because Caleb realized forgiveness wasn't about the other person. It was about freeing yourself from the prison of pain. He couldn't undo what happened 10 years ago, but he could choose not to carry the wound for another 10. He brought Ethan home. Slowly, he helped his brother heal, physically and emotionally. They didn't return to the way things used to be, but they discovered something new, a quiet understanding built on compassion and the tears they once couldn't shed. In the end, forgiveness saved not just a man, but a bond that had once seemed shattered beyond repair. Sometimes, compassion isn't a weakness. It's the only strength powerful enough to break through the damage resentment can never touch. Part 3. When the people we love hurt us the most and leave scars that never fade. 3.1. I was terrified of becoming the man I once hated, until one moment changed everything. Lucas grew up in the quiet countryside of Western Ireland. The hills were soft and green, the air gentle. But inside his small family home, peace was a stranger. His father, Patrick, a former Navy soldier once full of pride and discipline, had become a bitter, broken man after retirement. Unemployment, alcoholism, and unresolved rage turned him into a storm that struck unpredictably. It started with shouting. Then came the slamming doors, the smashed chairs. And then, the blows. Lucas, only a boy of 7 or 8, was often the target. His mother endured it in silence, a numb acceptance that chilled more than the winter winds. Every time young Lucas heard his father's heavy boots outside the door, he braced himself for another nightmare. At 10, he tried to run away, only to be found the next day. For years, he sat staring at the mirror, asking himself, how can a man hurt his own blood like this? And he swore, I will never become him. But trauma doesn't vanish with time. It hides and festers. At 22, during a heated argument with his girlfriend, Lucas raised his hand. Not to strike, just a reflex. But in that moment, he saw himself clearly. The same bloodshot eyes, the shaking hand. He had become his father. The shock froze him. He knew he couldn't go on pretending everything was fine. Lucas sought therapy. At first, individual sessions. Then group meetings for survivors of domestic abuse. Every time he told his story, another layer of pain peeled away. And slowly, he began to understand. His father hadn't been born a monster. He was once a boy too. During a visit to his grandmother, Lucas heard the truth. His father had also grown up under an abusive man, Lucas's grandfather. The violence hadn't started with Patrick. It was inherited, passed down through generations of silence. Lucas realized then that forgiveness wasn't saying, it's okay. Forgiveness was choosing not to let the past write his future. He wrote a long letter to his father, though Patrick had already passed, pouring out all his pain, his rage, and unexpectedly, his compassion. He wrote, I don't forgive what you did. I forgive so I won't become it. So I can love and be loved, without fear that my hands will hurt someone the way yours did. And with that act, the cycle stopped with him. 3.2. She left me when I needed her most, but our final meeting melted my heart. Ava was born in a small coastal town in Italy, where sunlight poured through narrow cobbled streets, and the scent of salt clung gently to the air. But her childhood had none of that warmth. At the age of 4, her mother, Elena, left without a word. The handwriting shaky. Elena was dying in a small hospital and wanted to see Ava one last time. Ava froze. The hurt child inside her screamed, Now you want to see me? But another voice, quiet and compassionate, whispered, Go. You need to know. And she went. When Ava entered the hospital room, she barely recognized the frail woman lying in bed. Gray hair, sunken eyes, worn thin by illness and time. But when their eyes met, time seemed to stop. Elena cried, not with dramatic sobs, but soft, broken tears of regret. Ava stood still, heart pounding, unable to speak. Elena explained that she had been a scared 17-year-old girl, pregnant, abandoned, shamed, and pushed to the edge. After giving birth to Ava, she fell into deep depression. One day, that was the sentence Ava had waited decades to hear. And when it came, it wasn't anger that rose in her. It was compassion. She reached out, took her mother's fragile hand, and said softly, "Two brothers once grew up side by side, blood relatives, bound by love and raised on traditional values of fairness and honor. Mateo and Luis were only a year apart, and for most of their lives, they were more than just siblings, they were best friends. They worked together on the family land, dreamed of expanding the olive oil farm, and made a promise, never let money divide their bond. But life, as always, had its own plans. After their father passed away, the family estate, including the ancestral home, 20 acres of olive trees, and a small pressing mill, became the center of a storm neither brother could have foreseen. According to the will, everything was to be divided equally. But Luis, the elder brother, by the time he discovered the truth, it was too late. Luis's betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. But what no one saw was the deeper battle Mateo was waging within himself. One day, wandering aimlessly near the Sierra Morena mountains, he stayed for a few days, then weeks, then months. He began learning how to sit still, how to look deeply into his own pain, how to face himself without blaming others. There, in that silence, Mateo came to a life-altering realization. Even if he regained the land, he would never reclaim his peace unless he released his hatred. Mateo returned to the village and knocked on Luis's door. When Luis opened it, he looked older, worn by years of regret. Mateo said only one sentence, "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I no longer want to live one more day in hatred." Luis broke down in tears. It was the first time in 10 years they had looked at each other not as adversaries, but as brothers. Mateo never asked for the land back. But Luis, moved by that profound act of compassion, rewrote his will, restored Mateo's rightful share, and soon after, joined the monastery where his brother had found peace. Few wounds cut as deeply as being betrayed by family. But when we choose to let go, what we receive in return is not just relief, but a resurrection of something we thought had died. Mateo didn't just forgive. He saved himself from a life poisoned by resentment. And sometimes, that is the highest form of justice. Part 4. Forgiving the one who caused an irreparable loss. 4. Graham Carter was a retired schoolteacher, and his wife Helen worked as a librarian at the local high school. But their greatest pride and joy was their only son, Daniel. 17 years old, gentle, with eyes that shone like sunlight, Daniel dreamed of designing aircraft that could fly farther than humanity had ever imagined. On a cold winter night, Daniel was riding his bicycle home after sports practice, just like he always did. But that night, he never made it back to the warm glow of his family's front porch. On a poorly lit road, the house that once echoed with laughter fell into a deafening silence. Police launched an immediate investigation. Within weeks, they apprehended a suspect, 20-year-old Ethan Moore, a young man from the same town. Ethan confessed that he had been drinking, driving recklessly, and fled the scene in panic. He didn't deny the crime in court. But what shocked and enraged the community was the sentence. Only 6 years in prison, citing no intent to cause death. To the Carters, it felt like justice had abandoned them. The village erupted in anger. People protested outside the prison, demanding a harsher sentence. The media covered the case extensively. But as time passed, the world moved on, except for Graham and Helen, who were left in the bottomless pit of grief. Every meal without Daniel. Every morning without his cheerful, "good morning." Every night haunted by unanswerable questions. Why our child? How could someone walk free so easily after this? Their suffering stretched on for over a year, until Graham joined a grief support group for parents who had lost children to accidents. There, he heard stories of others, some so consumed by hatred they became ill. Forgiveness isn't about whether he deserves it. Forgiveness is so we can live. Those words planted a strange seed in Graham's heart. He began reading about Buddhism, about compassion, suffering. It wasn't a letter of condemnation, it was a letter of honesty. We once hated you. We wished you would suffer. But we now realize that living in hatred is another kind of prison. Daniel would never want us to waste our lives in darkness. So we write to you, not to excuse what happened, but to tell you, we no longer hate you. The letter shattered Ethan. For the first time, he requested a visit with them. That meeting moved even the prison staff to tears. On one side, the grieving parents. On the other, the remorseful young man who would carry this guilt forever. They embraced in silence. Ethan whispered, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I promise I will live a life worthy of what I took." 4 years later, when Ethan was released early, the man who took my husband's life, and the letter I wrote after countless sleepless nights. It was a softly drizzling day in Paris. Along the banks of the Seine, couples still held hands, undeterred by the chill of October. In a quiet street corner, Louise Tremblay, a woman in her early 30s, with chestnut brown hair falling just below her shoulders, was preparing dinner for the man she loved deeply, her husband, Mark. A simple meal, a glass of red wine, candles, and soft jazz playing from an old radio. But Mark never made it home. Just a few blocks from their apartment, on his way back from work, he was hit by a speeding car that swerved at a corner. The driver, 27-year-old Antoine, had been drinking at a bar after work and lost control of his vehicle. Mark was killed instantly. The last message he had sent Louise read, "Wait 20 more minutes for me." But from the sheer injustice of it all, why did Mark, so kind, so simple, so responsible, have to die because of someone else's recklessness? During the trial, Antoine never once raised his eyes. He avoided Louise's gaze. His family wept and begged for forgiveness, but Louise looked at them with a cold, distant expression, not out of hatred, but because she had no emotions left to give. She didn't attend the sentencing. A year passed. The pain no longer howled, but it hadn't gone silent either. She began to write a letter, not to the court, not for justice, but for her own liberation. She wrote about Mark, about their joyful days, their dreams of having a child, the silent pain. Then she wrote about Antoine, not as a killer, but as a lost young man, haunted by guilt and fear. "Antoine," she wrote, "I will never truly understand you, but I do understand this. If I keep hatred inside me, the dead will never rest in peace, and the living will never move forward." At the end of the letter, she added one line, "I forgive you, not because you deserve it." The nightmares that had haunted her every night stopped. She no longer woke up in cold sweats to the sound of imagined sirens. She could stand by the Seine, let the wind brush her face, and smile gently. Forgiveness didn't change the past, but it changed her, from someone living in the shadow of a tragedy to someone who realized that light could return if we opened our hearts and let it in. 4.3. My child died on the operating table, and what I did next shocked everyone. St. Margaret's Hospital in London had long been praised as one of the most advanced medical centers in the country, boasting a top-tier surgical team. It was also the place where, on a winter morning, her only child was just 9 years old and had been born with a congenital heart defect. The surgery had been meticulously planned. Every consultation, every risk chart, every assurance pointed to one thing. The procedure was considered very safe. Joanna had read it all carefully. But what no one told her was this: just a few moments of negligence can take away an entire life. The surgery ran longer than expected. When the operating room doors finally opened, there was no reassuring nod, no gentle smile, only the pale face of the surgeon. Joanna didn't scream. She collapsed into a chair, her body frozen. In that moment, every emotion drained from her. Emptiness. All she could hear were distant footsteps, muffled voices, and one question repeating over and over in her head: why my child? Family, lawyers, friends, all urged her to sue. A malpractice case would be strong. She could easily win millions in compensation. But Joanna said nothing. For days, she neither ate nor slept. She stayed in her small 2-bedroom flat, where Nathan's laughter had once filled the air every afternoon. Then one morning, as she passed the park where she used to play with her son, Joanna sat down on a bench and cried. But this time, it wasn't grief that drove her tears. It was a quiet question rising from deep within. If I only use this pain to seek revenge, will any other child actually be safer? The next day, she sent a letter to the hospital board. In it, she wrote, "I won't file a lawsuit. Not because I forgive you, but because I want something greater than an apology. I want this hospital to change." She offered to act as an independent observer during the hospital's review and reform of its internal safety protocols. She asked to speak with nurses, pharmacists, and junior doctors to understand where the system had failed. To everyone's surprise, Joanna refused all financial settlements. Instead, She proposed creating a foundation named after Nathan to fund specialized safety training for young medical professionals. The process took nearly 2 years. It wasn't smooth. Her quiet strength and unwavering pain made people see. She wasn't there to expose. They were all there to rebuild. On the day the hospital launched its fully automated anesthesia tracking system and hosted the first training event sponsored by the Nathan Foundation, Joanna sat quietly in the back row, holding a photo of her son. She didn't cry, but everyone knew. Something inside her had softened. No one could bring Nathan back, but by choosing not to retaliate and instead to reform, Joanna had given life to hundreds of children who would come after. And perhaps that was the highest form of forgiveness. Part 5. Stories of Forgiveness in Extraordinary Circumstances. 5. 1. The Prisoner and the Policeman. An unexpected story of forgiveness and transformation. In a prison on the outskirts of Cape Town, South Africa, there was a prisoner named Thabo Mbeki, a man convicted of armed robbery. Thabo's past was a series of abandonment, poverty, and violence. From the slums where he grew up to the street gangs where he sought recognition through fists. But throughout his years behind bars, what haunted Thabo most were memories of the brutal beatings he received from a police officer named Peter Voss, the very man who personally tortured him during his first interrogation, breaking his ribs and nearly killing him. At first, every time Thabo closed his eyes, he saw Peter's face, cold, emotionless, and violent. Hatred ran through his veins, and thoughts of revenge seemed the only thing keeping him alive in his cell. Yet one morning, after months of participating in meditation sessions organized by volunteers inside the prison, something inside Thabo began to shift. He no longer saw only cruelty in Peter's eyes, but began to recognize fear, tension, and the heavy burden that a man in uniform also carried. From that point, Thabo embarked on a journey of forgiveness, not initially for the officer, but first and foremost for himself. He slowly realized that his anger was merely a reaction to wounds that had not yet healed. Each time he meditated, he faced his pain head-on, without avoidance or blame. And during a group-sharing session, he told for the first time about being beaten by the police, but without anger in his voice, only a quiet sadness. What happened next surprised everyone. Thabo's story spread beyond the prison walls. One volunteer, who happened to be an old friend of Peter Voss, shared everything. Weeks later, the former police officer unexpectedly showed up at the prison, not as an enforcer of the law, but as a humble man coming to offer an apology. The meeting between Thabo and Peter took place in a simple room. There were no tears, no dramatic hugs like in the movies. Just two men, once prisoners of pain and resentment, now sitting face to face, acknowledging that they had both once been lost. Peter admitted that he had been consumed by hatred himself, having lost a loved one in a robbery, carrying bitterness into his work. Thabo looked at him for a long moment and said, "I no longer hate you. Holding on to hate is just imprisoning myself again." After that meeting, it is proof that forgiveness is not a gift for the wrongdoer, but freedom for ourselves. No one is born to carry hatred forever. And sometimes, the people we think will never change are the ones who move us the most. 5.2 The Veteran and the Forgiveness That Was Hard to Give. In a remote and rugged part of Afghanistan, once one of the fiercest battlefields of a prolonged war, there was a former soldier named Michael Carter. Michael was a member of the United States Marine Corps, having endured many months of intense firefights against insurgent groups. During a brutal ambush, Michael witnessed his unit being attacked without warning. Bullets flew relentlessly. Screams pierced the dry air, and explosions echoed across the barren landscape. Many of his comrades fell, including his closest friend James, who had shared countless memories with him since their rookie days. Michael was seriously wounded but lucky to survive, though the scenes of loss and warfare were etched deeply into his mind. Years passed. Michael returned to the U.S. bearing scars, not just on his body, but deep within his soul. Sleepless nights haunted him, plagued by nightmares of the war. He was angry, bitter, and filled with hatred toward those who had targeted his unit. But fate led Michael to a reconciliation workshop organized by a nonprofit for veterans suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. There, he met a man named Ahmad, a former member of an insurgent group who was now seeking a path to peace. Ahmad had endured similar tragedies, losses, and had also wrestled with hatred. This encounter marked the beginning of a challenging journey of forgiveness. Michael had to confront the most complex emotions, forgiving someone who had been his enemy, who had directly fired on his comrades. It was not easy. Memories and unhealed wounds continually pulled him back into darkness. But through each conversation and shared story, Michael began to see Ahmad not as an enemy, but as a person yearning for peace and change. Then, during a deeply emotional reconciliation seminar, Michael spoke words of forgiveness, not just for Ahmad, but also for himself, his past, and the unforgettable pain. He understood that forgiveness does not diminish the value of loss, but opens a door to move forward and find peace again. This journey is a vivid testament to the power of compassion, the power to break the cycle of hatred and violence and replace it with kindness and deeper understanding. 5. 3. The woman and her powerful choice to forgive. Sarah Thompson is a Canadian woman living in Vancouver, working as a graphic designer. But few know that over a decade ago, she endured a horrifying tragedy, being raped by a stranger while walking home at night. That experience plunged Sarah into a darkness filled with fear, pain, and prolonged anger. It took her many years to be able to speak about what happened, and during that time, the haunting past deeply affected her life, impacting her relationships, career, and mental health. Many around Sarah advised her to hold on to hatred, to fight back against the one who harmed her, even pursuing legal action to seek justice. But Sarah chose a different path, a path that was neither easy nor understood by everyone. She began a journey of meditation and practicing compassion, starting first with herself. Through long sessions of meditation, she learned to accept the negative emotions within without letting them control her life. Instead of being consumed by hatred and revenge, Sarah chose to forgive the perpetrator, not to excuse his actions, but to free herself from the chains of the past. This process was not quick. Sarah had to face many waves of intense emotions, despair to resentment, fear to loneliness. But each time she overcame a layer of emotion, she moved closer to inner peace. Then, at a forgiveness empowerment seminar, Sarah shared her story with a steady voice and bright eyes. She said, "Forgiveness is not forgetting or overlooking. Forgiveness is choosing not to let the past control your present and future." Sarah became an inspiration to many women who had suffered similar pain. She helped them understand that forgiveness is not weakness, but strength to move forward and love oneself. Sarah's story is proof that even in the darkest moments of life, one can find the light of compassion and the power of letting go. Part 6. Forgiveness in everyday life, small but significant. 6. 1. Forgiving an ex. When being ghosted hurts deepest. The story of being silently abandoned by an ex, commonly known as ghosting, has become all too familiar in the digital age, where connections can be instant yet severed without explanation. Emma Wilson, a 28-year-old woman living in New York City, experienced the emotional pain that many young people today can relate to. Emma and Jason had been dating for over a year. Their relationship was once full of hope and plans for the future. But one day, Jason suddenly disappeared. No messages, no calls, no explanation. Emma was left with emptiness and countless unanswered questions. At first, Emma felt confused and hurt. She wondered if she had done something wrong or if she wasn't enough to keep Jason. She fell into a deep loneliness, a sadness that felt endless. However, instead of holding on to pain and resentment, Emma chose to begin the journey of forgiveness. She realized that Jason's decision to leave this way said more about him than about her worth. His silence was not a denial of Emma's value, but a sign of immaturity and fear of facing difficulties. Forgiveness for Emma did not mean accepting Jason's actions or forgetting the past. It was a process of freeing herself from negative emotions, so she could open her heart to more positive things in life. In the following months, Emma dedicated time to loving and caring for herself. She focused on personal hobbies, reconnected with friends. Emma shares that forgiving an ex, especially in situations like ghosting, is not easy, but it is a crucial step to move on and find true happiness. Her story reminds us that in everyday life, 2. A roommate's betrayal, and a lesson on trust no textbook could teach. This is the story of Lena Fernandez, a Mexican student studying abroad in Canada, whose journey began with a simple, sincere trust in her roommate. As a freshman in a foreign land, Lena quickly bonded with Ava, a local student with a warm smile and a seemingly generous spirit. They shared everything: late-night meals, academic worries, and laughter that made the foreignness of a new country feel a little more like home. Lena often thought. Lena discovered that her credit card had been used fraudulently for online purchases, orders shipped directly to their shared apartment. After days of confusion and checking her accounts, the truth emerged. Ava, the same Ava who laughed with her, studied with her, cooked with her, had secretly stolen her credit card information and used it without permission. But she didn't hold on to bitterness. She chose not to involve the authorities, not to shame Ava online. Instead, she walked away, carrying with her not revenge, but wisdom. To Lena, forgiveness wasn't about making Ava feel better. It was about setting herself free. She refused to let anger become part of her identity. She refused to let this wound harden her view of friendship or humanity. Lena's story is proof that forgiveness doesn't always emerge from great tragedies. Sometimes it stems from quiet, personal betrayals that cut deep in silence. And in those moments, we define who we become. Not everyone can forgive someone who has betrayed their trust. But when we do, we expand our hearts. And the inner world we carry becomes just a little more spacious, a little more compassionate. Part 7. Forgiveness across religious, racial, and social divides. 7.1. Where the sounds of gunfire and weeping had become as ordinary as the wind, where hatred had seeped into every brick and every glance, lived a Muslim man named Samir. He had once been a father, a husband, a quiet mathematics teacher, before the war consumed everything. Samir had a peaceful family, his wife Layla, and their 2 young sons. But one winter night, while Samir was away tutoring to earn money for his youngest son's medicine, his house was shelled. His entire world collapsed into ash within minutes. Samir didn't cry. He had no tears left, only an empty space inside him, a void people often try to fill with hatred. But he didn't. He returned to the ruins, buried his family with his own hands, and stayed behind in the shattered village, living like a shadow. 3 years passed. One quiet afternoon, Samir learned the girl was the daughter of a Jewish woman named Miriam from a nearby town. She's the child of the man who murdered your sons. You owe her nothing. But Samir didn't answer. He gently lifted the child, brought her home, laid her on the same bed his daughter once slept in, cooked soup, changed her bandages, and sat by her bedside every night until she fell asleep. His actions sent shockwaves through the community. Some shunned him, calling him a traitor. But quietly, others began bringing him milk, medicine, and warm blankets, because they saw something long forgotten in his actions: humanity. Eventually, through an international humanitarian organization, Ruth's mother found her. Miriam couldn't believe her eyes when she saw her daughter alive, and even less when she learned the man who had saved her child was the one whose family her husband had indirectly destroyed. She knelt down, tears pouring down her face. I can't ask for your forgiveness. I don't dare. But I know I owe you the rest of my life. Samir looked at her for a long time, then quietly replied, You owe me nothing. We have all lost too much. Ruth left with her mother. Samir returned once more to his empty home. But this time, his heart was no longer frozen. In the shattered heart of a father who had lost everything, a tiny seed had taken root, a seed of compassion that had crossed the boundaries of hatred, of ethnicity, of war. Samir's story spread, featured in newspapers, told at global reconciliation forums. But to him, none of that mattered. He never thought of himself as noble. He simply believed. The compassion of a father became the last thing that survived. Not through guns, not through revenge, but through the quiet power of mercy. Samir left the world with a question too deep to ignore. In the end, what is stronger, hatred or the human heart? 7.2 The black woman who faced the officer who humiliated her and made a decision no one expected. Aaliyah was just 22 at the time. A final-year sociology student at a small university in Georgia, she deeply believed in the values she had grown up with: justice, equality, and human dignity. But one summer evening, all of that shattered in just a few minutes. That night, She was driving home after a night class when she was pulled over for swerving. Aaliyah assumed it was a routine stop, but the white police officer had something else in mind. Over the next 45 minutes, she was interrogated, yelled at, and searched, humiliated with racial slurs and accusations. Though she had no weapons, no illegal items, and had committed no real offense, she was dragged out of her car, pressed face down onto the hood in front of dozens of bystanders. They didn't keep in touch. They didn't become friends. But Aaliyah continued her journey. She became a social justice advocate, launched emotional awareness programs for new officers, and wrote about racial healing. Her story became widely shared in forums on justice and trauma recovery. She didn't forget what happened, but she chose not to let the past steal her future. At an international healing summit, she said, "I didn't forgive to free him. I forgave to free myself from the chains of what he did, because I deserve that freedom." Aaliyah wasn't just a survivor. Two men from opposing castes in India, one once oppressed, the other once cruel, choose to become friends. In a small village in southern India, where the scars of the caste system still run deep through everyday life, the story of Ravi and Kumar was something no one believed could ever happen. Ravi was born into an upper caste family. From a young age, he was taught that caste purity was sacred and that people like Kumar, a Dalit, considered untouchable, were to be avoided, controlled, and dominated. As a teenager, Ravi had insulted, bullied, and even physically abused Kumar without a hint of remorse. To him, Kumar wasn't a person, just a shadow beneath his feet. For Kumar, the wounds weren't just physical. His dignity was crushed, his voice silenced. He lived in quiet resentment, believing that justice would never belong to someone like him. But Kumar didn't give up. He studied hard, escaped the village for the city, and eventually became a social worker focusing on marginalized communities. Years later, during a local seminar on caste discrimination, Kumar returned as a guest speaker. He had no idea that Ravi, now a schoolteacher in the village, would be in the audience. When their eyes met, the air seemed to thicken. Ravi froze. Kumar stood silent. After the talk, Ravi approached Kumar, trembling. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he said. "I just want to say I was wrong, terribly wrong. I'm not that foolish boy anymore." But he chose not to let hatred define him. Ravi, once seated high above, learned to bow his head and truly listen. Their story spread throughout the region as something miraculous. Two men from opposite ends of a rigid social structure, once symbolizing oppressor and victim, now stood together to educate others. In a public talk, Kumar said, "I didn't forgive him because he deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry the burden of hatred anymore." Ravi added, "Being forgiven isn't a relief. It's a daily reminder to live in a way that honors it." In a society where caste wounds still fester, their actions were more than just forgiveness. They were a quiet revolution. A small step that shook the foundations of an old culture of division. And above all, it reminded everyone that healing doesn't begin with the law, it begins in the heart. Part 8. Forgiveness in times of war, when enemies no longer stand on the battlefield. 8. 1. The Vietnamese soldier who forgave the American veteran responsible for his unit's heavy losses, and the reunion that left everyone in silence. 30 years after the war, the air in Hue, thick and humid as always, seemed to hold its breath. David was the first to speak, his voice shaking. "I was part of the unit that raided your village in 1972. I gave the order. I didn't know, until later, what we did to your men. I've lived with it ever since." The Vietnamese man nodded slowly, his lips pursed, his eyes glistening. His name was Lu Van Ben, a former North Vietnamese soldier and commander of a unit nearly decimated in the attack. He had lost 27 of his men that day. Some were just boys, barely 18. "I know who you are." A space that preserves the haunting memories of one of humanity's darkest days. An elderly Japanese woman stood silently before a black and white photo of the ruined city. Her hair was silver, her figure frail, but her eyes held a fierce clarity tinged with sorrow. Her name was Aiko Tanaka, 82 years old, a survivor of the atomic bombing in 1945. Few knew that behind her small frame was a past almost too painful to imagine. Aiko had lost her parents and two younger sisters in an instant when the bomb was dropped on the city. She was just 2 years old, found beneath rubble with severe burns, the sole survivor of her family. That moment never left her, not always vividly, but always present. That day, the museum was hosting a special peace event featuring a few American veterans who had served in World War II. Among them was James Whitman, 99 years old, a former pilot involved in the bombing raids over Japan, including missions near Nagasaki. He hadn't dropped the atomic bomb himself, but he had been part of the vast war machine that brought devastation. Aiko hadn't known he would be there. When he was introduced, they stood just meters apart, saying nothing. The room seemed to hold its breath. James stepped forward. He walked with a cane, his movements shaky but determined. He stopped in front of Aiko and spoke with a raspy voice. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I've carried this regret my entire life." Aiko looked at him. A long silence followed. Then, to everyone's surprise, she reached out her arms. A hug. Slow, deliberate, and completely unexpected. It didn't last long, but in that moment, the entire museum fell silent. No camera clicks. No whispers. "I'm not hugging you to forget. I'm hugging you so we stop passing this hatred on." He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. She remained composed, but inside, it was as if she had finally set down a weight she'd carried for a lifetime. Their story quickly spread, not only across Japan but around the world. For many, a handshake between former enemies, and the tears of a war long gone. In a devastated village near Kharkiv, where bombs once dictated the rhythm of daily life, and broken homes still stood like open W. Neither of them was the same man who once marched with fire in his eyes. Their hair was now streaked with gray, their eyes burdened with the kind of memories no one should carry. Their meeting wasn't ordered by any government, nor staged for political reconciliation. It was something far more human, a silent, personal quest to let go. Mikola now volunteered for a reconstruction organization, helping rebuild villages along the war-torn border. Ivan had returned as a civilian, no longer clad in uniform, but carrying planks of wood, bricks, and a quiet apology he had never spoken aloud. They met at a small rebuilding camp. For a long moment, no one spoke. They stood facing each other, not enemies anymore, but not yet friends. The ground beneath them had once been a front line. The wind whispered through broken walls, as if to remind them of the blood spilled on both sides. Ivan was the first to break the silence. He didn't speak of politics or who was right or wrong. He simply said, "I don't know how much I took, but I want to give something back. If not time, then at least these two hands." Mikola stared at him. In his mind, men like Ivan had caused everything he'd lost, nameless faces behind the muzzle of a gun. But here he was, lifting bricks beside him, rebuilding the wall of a school that had been reduced to rubble. Day after day, they worked together, not saying much. As they cleared debris and rebuilt roofs, they didn't share words so much as silence filled with understanding. Ivan spoke of losing his brother during the campaign. Mikola shared that his youngest son died from a bomb shard. There were no more tears, just hollow eyes that had cried too much already. One afternoon, after finishing the roof of the last house on a battered street, Ivan stood quietly, gazing up at the orange-streaked sky. Mikola walked up and extended his hand. A handshake, simple in appearance, but to two men who had once sworn to kill each other, it was nothing short of a miracle. They didn't say it, but in that moment, the war inside them ended. The villagers who witnessed it didn't clap or cheer. They simply stood still, as if afraid to disturb the fragile holiness of something rare but real, forgiveness. A Western journalist happened to be there that day. He wrote about the moment and shared a photograph. Two men, one Ukrainian, one Russian, shaking hands amid ruins. The image went viral, not because either man was a hero, but because they had chosen the hardest path, to stop hating. In a world where war doesn't just destroy homes, but shatters trust, perhaps that handshake was a quiet reminder. Unexpected reunions, and the door to forgiveness swings open. 9.1 The teacher, the child, and a past no one expected. A hug that opened the door to forgiveness. 20 years after her husband was killed in a late-night break-in, Anna Muller, an elementary school teacher in Hamburg, had slowly rebuilt a quiet life. The pain had never truly disappeared. It merely lay dormant in a quiet corner of her heart. What she never expected was that fate would test her in the most painful and surreal way. The boy's name was Leon. Quiet, observant, a little withdrawn. Anna gave him special attention, not out of pity, but because something in his gaze deeply moved her. Leon was a good student, well-behaved, and gradually grew close to Anna. One day, during a parent-teacher meeting, Leon's mother came to speak with Anna. Their conversation started off as usual, until the woman, eyes lowered, voice trembling, suddenly asked, "Ms. Muller, do you remember your husband, Thomas Muller?" Anna froze. "Why do you ask?" The woman's voice cracked. "I'm the wife of the man responsible for his death. He's Leon's father." The room seemed to freeze. In that moment, all the memories came rushing back. The pain, the anger, the years of grief. Anna stood silently. She looked at the woman, trembling, remorseful, opened her arms, and embraced Leon. Without saying a word, the whole school fell silent. Some witnesses wept. That day, Anna did not just forgive a past that had shattered her life. She opened the door to a future where no one would be punished for wounds they did not cause. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it frees us from being imprisoned by it. And sometimes, the greatest acts of forgiveness come from a quiet, unspoken embrace. 9. No one would have guessed that this man had spent 10 years behind bars for a crime he never committed. 2 decades earlier, Merrick worked as a technician at a power plant. An accident occurred, resulting in the death of a colleague. The public demanded accountability, and the only witness, a coworker named Tomasz, testified that Merrick was responsible for the mistake. Merrick couldn't prove otherwise. There was no evidence to defend him. No one stood up for him. He was convicted. During his time in prison, the same question haunted him. Why did Tomasz do it? Was it fear? Was it something else? But over the years, Merrick learned to let go. He studied meditation, read Buddhist texts, and made a promise to himself. If he ever got out, never told anyone the full story. Until that afternoon, when he saw a man collapse on the sidewalk, pale and trembling. Merrick rushed to help, lifting him onto his bike and taking him to the nearest clinic. Only after the emergency treatment began did he truly look at the man's face. It was Tomasz. Merrick froze. Time seemed to stop. All the memories rushed back. And yet, he said nothing. He sat quietly in the hallway, waiting. When Tomasz regained consciousness, the first face he saw was the man he had sent to hell. Tears streamed down Tomasz's face. He admitted he had lived with guilt for 20 years. That he had lied out of fear, afraid of losing his job, afraid of blame. That later, when the truth emerged, he no longer had the courage to face Merrick. Merrick reached for his hand. No accusation. No bitterness. Only one sentence. "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I want to be free." A middle-aged woman stood waiting, her hands trembling. Her name was Emily Russo, 43 years old. In her hand was a faded photograph, 2 little girls laughing in a small garden in the countryside, during a chaotic family split that she could only vaguely recall. After the divorce, her mother took her older sister to another country, while Emily was left behind with her maternal grandparents. No one ever explained much, only vague promises that you'll understand when you're older. But as Emily grew up, the unanswered questions turned into resentment. Why did her sister leave and never return? Why did she have to grow up alone, carrying the weight of abandonment through a lonely childhood? For over 3 decades, Emily never saw her sister again. But the memory of her, soft brown hair and gentle eyes, often surfaced in dreams filled with aching sorrow. Emily eventually married and had children, but that invisible wound never quite healed. Then one day, an unexpected message on social media changed everything. A woman named Sophie, living in Montreal, Canada, wrote, "I think I might be your sister." After months of exchanging memories, verifying old documents, and even taking a DNA test, the truth became undeniable. Emily held her breath as she saw a woman step down, gray-streaked hair, soft eyes, a small suitcase in hand. When their eyes met, time seemed to stop. There were no words, no blame. Just Emily running into her sister's arms, sobbing like a child. Sophie cried too. For 40 years, she had lived with guilt, for not protecting her sister, for letting her grow up without the love they once shared. Many times, she had tried to find Emily, but was blocked by family, by life, by fear. Now, standing in the middle of the station, they held each other, not as strangers, not as two people burdened by the past, but as sisters. One had once held on to anger. The other had long carried shame. And yet, in that moment, nothing remained but tears. There were no more questions, no more bitterness, just one long, overdue embrace. And somehow, it was enough to melt decades of distance and pain. Because forgiveness doesn't rewrite the past, but it softens the scars it left behind. And sometimes, just one embrace is enough to say, "You're still here. I'm still here." And our bond was never truly lost. Part 10. Forgiveness from those who have nothing, except a compassionate heart. 10. 1. The homeless father and the reunion that brought his son to his knees in tears. On a cold afternoon in Philadelphia, passers-by witnessed a strange and moving scene. A well-dressed young man, head bowed in tears, kneeling before an elderly, ragged man leaning against a weathered brick wall. And full of potential, he grew up in a broken family. His mother had left when he was still a child, and his father, Marcus, was an uneducated laborer, poor but determined to provide for his son's education. Yet in Caleb's eyes, his father was a burden, a symbol of failure and poverty, everything he wanted to escape from. When Caleb entered college, he cut all ties with his father. He didn't want his friends to know where he came from. He changed his phone number, never returned home, and even had campus security escort his father away when Marcus once showed up to give him his meager savings. During one particularly heated argument, Caleb shouted words he would regret for years. "You're the reason my life is stuck. I wish I was never your son." From that moment on, Marcus disappeared from his life, as if he had never existed. Years passed, until one day, during a business trip, he caught sight of a familiar face sitting silently in a street corner. It was his father, now homeless, with white hair and eyes that had grown still. But because he had finally encountered the unconditional love he had spent his life searching for. From that day forward, everything changed. Caleb brought his father home, and they started over. They didn't erase the past. They chose to heal it, one day at a time. Forgiveness doesn't always come from those in power or privilege. Sometimes, it comes from those who have nothing left, except a heart wide enough to let go of anger. And in that, they are the strongest of all. 10. To the woman who survived human trafficking, and the letter of forgiveness she wrote to the man who sold her. Along the border between Romania and Ukraine, where war, poverty, and chaos had gripped the region for years, the story of a woman named Alina has left many in tears. She was once a victim of human trafficking. Her family had fallen into extreme poverty. At just 17, she was lured abroad by a man she knew, someone named Yuri, who promised her a legal job and a better life. But instead of arriving in Germany, as he had said, Alina was sold into a human trafficking ring. She was passed from place to place, treated as property in dark rooms without names, without light, and without the right to say no. During those years, Alina often wanted to die. She screamed. She hated. She once swore that if she ever saw the man who betrayed her again, she would make sure he paid. But after many years of surviving, escaping, and receiving support from a non-profit organization that helped her reintegrate into society, Alina chose a different path. In a group therapy session, when asked, "Would you like to send a message to the person who led you into that darkness?" Alina wrote a letter. She didn't know where Yuri was, whether he was still alive or had fled, but she wrote it anyway, not for him, but for herself. Part of the letter read, "I once hated you to the core of my bones. I used to wish you could feel what I felt. But then I realized, if I spend my whole life hating you, I'm still your victim, even after I'm free. I'm not writing this letter because you deserve forgiveness, but because I no longer want to carry you in my heart for the rest of my life." Alina chose to forgive, not by erasing the painful memories, but by no longer letting them govern her soul. She returned to school, began working at a center for human trafficking survivors, and became a storyteller, using her voice to protect others from the path she once walked. When asked by the media if she had anything to say to those who once profited off her body, Alina simply said, "I don't carry them in my heart anymore. That's how I win." Alina's forgiveness was not an act of weakness. It was a sign of rare strength, of a human rising from destruction and deep wounds, and still choosing the higher path. No revenge, no bitterness, no darkness allowed to rule the heart. And perhaps, It is those who once had nothing left, like Alina, who are the clearest proof that compassion is not a gift. It is a choice, a force of will, and a light that only those who have walked through darkness can truly radiate. 10.3 The letter from a dying bed, and the forgiveness that came with her last breaths. In a small room at St. Christopher's Hospital in Spain, a young woman lay quietly on her bed. Her body was frail, her hair all gone from chemotherapy, but her eyes still lit up when someone entered. Her name was Lucia Morales, 28 years old, diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer. Doctors said she had only weeks left to live. But in that fleeting moment of life, Lucia did something that moved everyone to tears. She wrote a letter forgiving her parents, those who had abandoned her when she was only 3 years old. Lucia grew up in an orphanage in Granada. She never received letters, gifts, or even a phone call from her parents. Whenever other families came to visit, she would stand behind the window, hoping someone would call her name. No one ever did. An elderly couple from Zaragoza arrived at the hospital. When they entered Lucia's room, both collapsed to their knees. They were her biological parents. They shared that back then, believing they no longer deserved her. Until they heard the letter. Lucia didn't say much when they arrived. She simply held her mother's hand and gave a gentle smile. Her mother burst into tears, whispering apology after apology. Her father knelt beside her bed, trembling. "You don't have to call us anything, but please let me stay here until your final breath." Lucia passed away 2 days later, in the arms of the very people who had once abandoned her, now the ones most shattered by regret. But in her final moments, Lucia carried no bitterness, only forgiveness, as light as petals floating in the afternoon sun. And perhaps that is the silent strength of compassion, not forgetting what hurt us, but choosing to release it, especially when no one ever asked to be forgiven. Part 11. When forgiveness becomes a spiritual act, transcending the limits of language. 11.1. It wasn't just a place of practice, but a sanctuary for the villagers, a spiritual refuge in a chaotic world. The head monk, an elderly man named Shunyo, had lived there for over 40 years, spending his days chanting sutras, tending the garden, and receiving the sorrowful with a smile as gentle as the morning mist. Then one winter night, flames erupted from the main hall, and the stone courtyard was covered in soot. The people wept. But strangely, the old monk did not. He simply stood in silence. He confessed to hating Buddhism, to hating that temple because he had been abandoned there as a child. When police came to inform Master Shunyo and asked if he wanted to press charges, the old monk simply pressed his palms together and replied, "I only wish to chant a sutra for him." No one could understand. The villagers were outraged, demanding justice. The young man couldn't lift his head, but when the monk entered, he said nothing of judgment. He simply smiled and sat down across from him. "Are you in pain, my child?" he asked. And the young man broke down in tears, tears that seemed to burst through layers of guilt, rage, and fear. The monk said no more, just opened his sutra book and chanted a short passage, not for the dead, but for the living. After the brief chant, he rose gently, walked over, and embraced the one who had reduced his sacred home to ashes. An embrace without judgment. No boundary between monk and sinner. No need for spoken forgiveness. Just one gesture to say. But the heart of a human being, if no one sees it with compassion, may remain forever burned. In a world where people believe every mistake must be punished, and only when someone is calm enough, compassionate enough, to walk through the flames and touch that wound with love, not revenge. Lucas Moreau was once a successful financial consultant in Lyon, France. At 45, he owned a prestigious consulting firm, a beautiful home, a prized wine collection, and a plan to retire in southern Italy. But everything collapsed in a single year. His best friend from university, Arnaud, after much persuasion, convinced Lucas to invest all his assets into a high-return overseas fund. The paperwork was flawless. Phone calls from international partners were professionally arranged. Lucas did not file charges. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't hold a press conference. A week after the blow, he sold his last apartment, sent the money to his aging mother, and boarded a train to the Alps. Nobody knew exactly what happened to him after that. It wasn't until 2 years later that someone stumbled upon Lucas again, living quietly in a small monastery on Mont Saint-Baume. His head was shaved. He wore a simple gray robe. He wasn't ordained. Where Saint Mary Magdalene once lived in penance. When an old friend from Lyon came to visit and asked why he had chosen to disappear into monastic life, Lucas simply smiled and replied, "I once wanted to sue him. I wanted to take everything back. But I realized, if I kept feeding my resentment, I would lose even more. I was scammed once. But if I stayed angry, I'd keep scamming myself every single day." He shared that, in the early days on the mountain, his mind was filled with screams. Why? How could he betray me? But through daily meditation, and each silent walk along the rocky forest paths, something shifted. Silence began to seep in. And within that silence, something strange happened. The rage faded. What remained was a deep sorrow. But simply to say he forgave him. He asked for no explanation, expected no apology. In the letter, he wrote, "I hope you live the rest of your life without being haunted. If you were ever truly my friend, I don't want you to live in a personal hell. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I need to be free." Not everyone who loses everything can forgive. But Lucas chose a path no one expected. Not revenge, not legal battle, not victimhood. He chose silence. He chose to retreat into the mountains so his heart could finally let go, like a final autumn leaf, drifting gently to the earth. In those ancient caves and quiet pine forests, he learned a truth. 11.3 A mother prayed for her son's killer and melted a village consumed by hatred. The small village of San Pedro de la Paz, nestled quietly by a still lake in southern Chile, had known peace for generations. That peace was shattered one winter night by a murder that stunned the entire community. The victim was 12-year-old Emilio, and the perpetrator was a young man from the neighborhood named Diego, not yet 20. Diego and Emilio had once played together as children, but as they grew older, Diego was drawn into a rough crowd, eventually getting involved with drugs and violence. One night, during a drug-induced hallucination, Diego panicked and lashed out. Emilio, walking home from school, was the innocent victim. The whole village was in shock. Emilio's family was devastated. His mother, Camila, could barely stand from grief. In the days following her son's death, Camila moved through life like a ghost. Every morning, she would sit silently in front of Emilio's empty room. And then Camila did something no one could have predicted. She went to a small Buddhist temple in the hills, one run by a Thai nun, and asked to hold a prayer ceremony not for her son, but for Diego, the boy who had taken her son's life. When the nun gently asked her why, Camila simply replied, "I can't let my heart become another fire. If I hate him, then I'm killing again, this time myself." The memorial ceremony took place on the temple grounds one quiet afternoon. At first, only a few curious onlookers came. But word spread quickly that the victim's mother was praying for her son's murderer, and the crowd grew. The initial mood was skeptical, even hostile. Some whispered, "She's gone mad." But as the temple bell rang and the nun's chants filled the air like a breath of wind, something began to shift. Camila knelt, holding a framed photo of Emilio, and whispered prayers for Diego, praying that his soul would find light and not be buried forever in the darkness of guilt. She didn't deny her pain, but in her eyes, there was no hatred, only an immense, mysterious compassion. The story spread throughout the region like an unexpected breeze. People began to ask themselves, if the mother could forgive, why were they still holding on to anger? Those who once talked about beating Diego turned away from vengeance. Some quietly visited the temple to light incense. Others even wrote letters to the prison, expressing hope that Diego would truly change. And Diego, upon receiving news of the prayer ceremony, reportedly wept for hours in his cell. He wrote a handwritten letter to Camila, confessing his guilt and saying, "If I ever leave this prison, I don't expect forgiveness, but I promise to live the rest of my life doing good, in Emilio's name." No one knows exactly how Camila endured her pain, but after the ceremony, she returned to the temple every week, bringing white flowers to lay at the Buddha's feet, sitting in long meditations. Perhaps it was the quiet strength of her forgiveness, not shouted, but lived, that transformed an entire community. A story that reminded everyone, when even the most broken heart can open, no one has any reason to keep theirs locked in hatred. Part 12. Forgiving yourself. the hardest step in the healing journey. 12.1. A quiet prayer for the child she never held. One woman's path to self-forgiveness. In a quiet corner of Florence, Italy, beneath the soft light of a small chapel tucked between worn stone alleys, a woman sat still every Sunday morning. Her name was Elena Rossi, a piano teacher in her mid-40s, known for her gentleness and the melancholic beauty that came through in her playing. To most, she lived a simple life, teaching music to neighborhood children and tending a small garden on her balcony. But beneath that calm exterior, Elena carried a silent burden for over 2 decades. At the age of 21, alone and overwhelmed, she had made the decision to terminate a pregnancy. The man involved had disappeared when he learned of the child, and with no family support, no money, and fear gripping her heart, she did what many women have done in desperate silence. She told no one. She moved on. Or at least, that's what she thought. Years passed. Elena built a life. But every time she passed a child in the street, every time a student of hers hugged their mother at the end of a lesson, something in her heart would tighten. Guilt, like a slow and steady river, eroded her inner peace. She never married. She told herself she didn't need to. But the truth was, she felt unworthy of motherhood, as if she had forfeited the right. The turning point came not through religion, but through a stray cat. One rainy night, she found a tiny kitten shivering near her doorstep, soaked and weak. Without thinking, she wrapped it in a towel and nursed it back to health. She named him Luce, meaning light. For the first time in years, her mornings began with something warm curled beside her, and her heart, for reasons she didn't fully understand, began to thaw. That winter, Elena started visiting the chapel near her apartment. Not for mass, not even for confession. She would sit quietly in the back, letting the silence of the space wash over her. One day, she found a small notebook left behind on a pew, filled with handwritten prayers. Some were for sick parents, others for lost loves. One prayer, written in shaky cursive, read, "To the child I never met, I'm sorry. I love you." She broke into tears. It was as if someone had written what her soul had carried for years. From that day, she began writing her own letters, each one addressed to her unborn child. She wrote not as a victim, not as someone asking to be punished, but as a mother who finally found the courage to speak. The letters were filled with love, sorrow, and slowly, forgiveness. To her surprise, the act of writing became a form of prayer, a way to let go. Elena didn't seek redemption from anyone else. No priest, no therapist, no friend. Her healing came from acknowledging the truth to herself, from allowing herself to mourn and to love what had been lost. She began volunteering at a center for single mothers, offering free piano lessons to the children there. She never told them her story, but when she looked into their eyes, she saw a reflection of something she had once feared, life itself, in all its fragile wonder. Years later, one of her students asked, "Why do you always smile when we play sad songs?" Elena replied, "Because sadness, when accepted, can be the most beautiful part of being alive." In the heart of Florence, in the quiet notes of a piano, and in the gentle touch of a woman who once could not forgive herself, compassion found a home again. Not from someone else, not from the world, but from within. Because sometimes, the hardest person to forgive is the one we see in the mirror. And yet, when that forgiveness finally comes, it opens the door to a peace deeper than words, and to a love that was always there, just waiting to be let in. 12.2. The one who caused harm, and the silent journey to self-forgiveness. In a quiet town near Lake Lucerne, Switzerland, lived a man named Matteo Keller, in his early 50s, who worked as a restorer of antique books. With silver hair and eyes that seemed forever lost in the past, he spoke little and lived alone in a wooden house by the pine forest, where winters were always blanketed in snow and summers echoed only with the turning of ancient pages. People in town knew Matteo as a gifted man of few words, but few knew why he had lived in seclusion for nearly 2 decades. His story began when he was still a young university lecturer in Zurich, full of promise and potential. In those years, Matteo had fallen in love with a colleague, Anna Weber, a brilliant literature professor, strong, sensitive, and deeply passionate. They were in love, but their relationship was turbulent. During one heated argument, consumed by pride and anger, Matteo lashed out with cruel words that shattered Anna's heart. He accused her of things she hadn't done, doubted her love, and walked away without apology. Just weeks later, Anna left the university and disappeared from academic life. Years later, Matteo learned that she had spent time in a psychiatric hospital and never returned to teaching. Since then, guilt clung to him like a shadow. A single moment of harsh words had destroyed a gifted woman's future. He could never forgive himself. Each year, he wrote letters of apology, hundreds of them, but never sent a single one. He didn't dare look for Anna. He felt he didn't deserve forgiveness. So, he left the city and moved to the mountains, choosing a life of solitude. He devoted himself entirely to one thing: restoring torn and forgotten books, as if trying to heal what he himself had once broken. One day, while restoring a centuries-old Buddhist scripture, Matteo came across a passage that read, "No blade is sharper than the tongue, yet no remedy is more sacred than silence and sincerity." That line struck him deeply. He began to wonder, was clinging to guilt another form of ego? But as a gift to himself. In it, he wrote the full story of his relationship with Anna. Every page was an apology, a truth revisited, a chapter rewritten with compassion instead of self-punishment. 3 years later, Matteo went to the last known address where Anna had lived. But the house was empty. A neighbor told him she had passed away from a stroke a few years earlier. Matteo stood silently in front of the old gate for a long time. Then he placed the book on the doorstep, like a final offering of incense to a departed soul. That night, for the first time in years, Matteo sat beside the fireplace, closed his eyes, and whispered a simple sentence. "Anna, I'm sorry. I wish I had understood sooner. But today, I ask to forgive myself, not to forget, but to live fully the life that remains." From that night on, Matteo began opening his home to young students in the region, teaching them about books, calligraphy, and the art of preserving what is precious. And in every lesson, he spoke about the power of words, of empathy, and of forgiveness. People no longer saw just a silent man restoring ancient texts. They saw someone who had once made a grave mistake, and who had finally learned life's hardest lesson: to forgive oneself, with humility and sincerity. 12.3. Walking through irreversible mistakes, and still choosing to forgive oneself. In the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia, a man named Jonathan Reeves lived a quiet life as a community gardener. To anyone passing by, he seemed like a gentle soul in his 60s, always tending to plants with care, speaking kindly to the neighborhood children, and offering herbs or fresh tomatoes with a soft smile. But beneath his calm exterior lay a story he had spent decades carrying like a stone in his chest. Jonathan had once been a medical intern, bright, ambitious, and eager to prove himself. During his final year at university, while assisting in a rural clinic, he made a clinical decision that went against protocol. It was not reckless, but it was unapproved, and the result was tragic. A young pregnant woman, Emily, lost her life due to a delayed diagnosis that Jonathan had misjudged. Though the senior physician took part of the responsibility, Jonathan was consumed by guilt. Emma's husband, devastated and heartbroken, had looked into Jonathan's eyes and asked only one question: "Why didn't you listen?" It was a question that echoed in Jonathan's mind every night for years. He never returned to medicine. He withdrew from the path he had worked so hard for. Instead, he moved far away, took odd jobs, and eventually found solace in gardening, nurturing life from the soil. Perhaps because he felt he had once taken life from the world. For a long time, Jonathan lived with silent punishment. He refused to be happy. Whenever someone praised his garden or thanked him for his kindness, he would feel a pang of shame, thinking he didn't deserve peace. One winter, however, something shifted. An old friend from medical school visited him and asked plainly, "How long do you plan to hold yourself hostage?" That question struck a deeper chord than the years of guilt ever had. Jonathan realized he had made his sorrow into an identity. He had lived not as a man, but as a memorial to his mistake. He began to change, not quickly, but intentionally. He read books on compassion, Buddhist texts on karma and forgiveness, and practiced meditation every morning. At first, he could only direct loving kindness toward the woman he had failed, then toward her family. Much later, hesitantly, toward himself. He wrote a long letter addressed to Emma, not for anyone to read, but for his own heart. In it, he wrote, "I know I can never undo what was done. But if there is any part of you still watching, I hope you see that I have tried every day since to honor life, to care, to never forget. I am sorry, and today, I ask not for forgiveness from you, but permission to stop destroying myself." It was the first time Jonathan allowed himself to breathe fully in years. After that, he began teaching young volunteers at the garden, not just about plants, but about presence, about listening, and about the silent wisdom of patience. Occasionally, he would tell them, without specifics, that he had once made a mistake that changed someone else's life forever, and that no punishment, no self-loathing, could ever rewrite the past. But, he would add softly, we can still honor the pain by the way we choose to live forward. Jonathan never forgot Emma. He didn't pretend his past didn't exist, but he stopped using it as a reason to live half a life. And that, perhaps, is the quiet miracle of self-forgiveness, not erasing the wound, but no longer letting it define who you are. Part 13. Conclusion. Forgiveness is the gateway to peace. Forgiveness is not a simple act. It doesn't happen in a single moment, and it doesn't always come with tears or emotional embraces. Forgiveness, in its purest form, is a quiet, deeply personal inner journey that no one but the person going through it can fully understand. Each story in this journey, from those who lost a child to those who lost themselves, is like a mirror reflecting pain, wounds, and the extraordinary human ability to transcend them. The people in these stories were not heroes. They were ordinary individuals, sometimes victims, sometimes those who caused pain. But it was their choice to forgive, despite having every reason not to, that transformed them into symbols of liberation. Forgiveness cannot turn back time or erase the scars, but it opens a door that leads to peace, not for anyone else, but for the one carrying the burden. The mother who performed a prayer ritual for the one who took her child's life didn't do so because she forgot the pain, but because she didn't want to live the rest of her life consumed by hatred. The man who lost everything to fraud didn't seek revenge, because in meditation, he saw clearly that vengeance never truly frees anyone. The one who made a mistake they could never undo still found a way to heal, by cultivating deep compassion from within. Forgiveness is not a denial of truth. It is an acceptance that no matter what happened, we have the right not to let it control our heart and mind anymore. And so, each of us, carrying some kind of sorrow, perhaps betrayed, perhaps grieving, perhaps guilty, can still walk through that door. No one needs to be perfect to be forgiven, and no one needs permission to begin again. Forgive not for others. Forgive because your heart deserves peace. To close, let us remember a gentle yet profound teaching of the Buddha. You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by your anger. May every story in this series become a mirror, not only for those who lived them, but also for us, the listeners, to learn how to understand, to have compassion, and to let go. Because in the end, forgiveness is not a sign of weakness. It is the mark of a courageous heart. There are things that have happened in life that, even now, the mere act of remembering makes the heart ache as if a wound has just been torn open. A word that shamed us. A look filled with contempt. A cruel deception. A betrayal we never saw coming. Or perhaps a loss so great it can never be restored. They say time heals all wounds, but the truth is, some wounds are not in the flesh, they live in our memories. And memories do not forget. We go on living, smiling, working, yet inside are pieces of the soul left behind. Sometimes it is the abandoned child within. Sometimes the woman betrayed. The man whose closest friend turned away. The son or daughter who carried resentment toward their parents through all of childhood. These parts of us remain in the past, never embraced, never apologized to, and never forgiven.